Everything I asked had a blank stare. They didn't know where they're moving. They didn't know what they're going to do with the money. They didn't know the plan. And I started digging. So I didn't push hard, but I said, would you mind if I got involved? I truly got to build a new kind of relationship with my parents.
Welcome to The Endgame by ClearEstate, life's final chapter discussed openly. I'm Davide
joined by Sara, our head expert on all things estate planning and administration. Welcome, Sara.
Thanks, Davide.
The goal of this podcast is to have some frank discussions about difficult times, but also some positive and constructive conversations about securing a family's future financially, but also a family's legacy. This episode is really about that very first family meeting in the context of estate planning, how to trigger and how to start thinking and how to start the initial conversation around estate planning. The question is how, in the context of a family, how do you delicately introduce that conversation in a family setting, whether as a child to a parent, whether as a friend to somebody else. And it's going to be interesting because we're going to hear about one of the key ideas of our guest, but role playing as well is important, kind of like developing scenarios and role playing what could happen and how people would react in certain situations. You have experience with this. What's the framing for somebody listening to this? What's the framing for the various conversations we're going to have today? We have one with Marc, who you know very well, and then we have conversations with some of our internal experts. So people that do this on a daily, weekly basis, it's their bread and butter. So how should I be listening to these conversations in order to get the most out of them?
The reality is, thinking about having these sometimes difficult conversations is really thinking about it as a gift for your executor and your family when the time comes, right? The more information and insights that you can share in advance, the more, likely your family's going to experience a, relatively smooth process when that inevitable time comes. So I would think, kind of just look at it as a way to provide that gift to your family ultimately, and recognize that, it is a little bit of homework and it is something that, takes a little bit of sometimes poking and prodding, but it's well worth it for everyone involved, for peace of mind, and hopefully to help maintain, family relationships and all of those things that I think everyone, cares quite deeply about.
Yeah, and what I'm looking forward to in these conversations is, some tactical advice, kind of like strategy, role playing, wording. So I think there's a lot of depth there. So amazing episode. Coming up next, Marc Seguin, author, speaker, and end-of-life consultant, teaches us how to run that crucial first family meeting.
Thank you for having me, and I've followed your journey since day one, and I'm cheering in the background.
Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. We're going to get into your story a little bit later, getting straight into it. We talk about estate planning. We talk about estate management. You talk about family dynamics. We talk about people being aware and having open conversations about end of life in general and what happens towards the end, whether that's incapacity, whether that's death, and what happens with our stuff, as we talked about in a previous podcast. But you talk about triggers. Tell us a little bit more about triggers.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned about all of those different types of difficult conversation that we all know are sometimes are taboo. I go to a lot of, whether it's estate planning, financial planning, advanced care planning kind of seminars or whatever, and they all say you need to have open conversations. And then when we talk to people, everyone says, well, how do I get started? And so on and so forth. And I give some of those talks myself. And I always say you need a trigger. You need to get started. So you don't wait for a crisis or a major event in your life or a life transition. You try to find a trigger, and usually a positive trigger. There are various triggers depending on your context. I'll tell you in my parents' case, it was, they were of the old generation that didn't talk much about the death. They didn't talk much. I knew they had a will. I knew I was named as a co-executor of my sister. I knew the will was in the fireproof box in the corner, but that's about as much as I knew. And I didn't worry too much because I knew there was a buffer. They owned the house, and should something happen, I knew it was there. But the day, in the case of my parents, the trigger was the day they decide to sell the house. And that proliferated a whole bunch of thoughts in my mind, including some worries, and that was the trigger for me to open the conversation. If you're proactive like me, I knew it was important. I wanted to do it. Clearly, in my case, I'd written a book around all of this types of topics, so it was a trigger, but I knew it would take time.
In your particular case, you talked about your parents. You say old generation. I mean, all of our parents are old generation, but you're right that culturally, sometimes people have a harder time talking about these things. Or are not as open to having these types of conversations in a family dynamic. How did you approach that with parents that clearly had no intention of having as a dinner conversation what's going to happen when we leave this earth?
I had a concern. They were already 87 and 88 and very active. And I said, well, they could live to 100. They've never had any medication. And it was the sale of the house. When they decided to sell the house, it was good news because it was time for them to move out of the country house and move closer to city, whether in residence or not, to have the care. So that was the good news. But it triggered me. What are they going to do with the money? What's the plan? Do they really have a solid plan? And I was worried about longevity and so on and so forth. I won't go through all the worries I had, but literally after I said, "Oh, great! I'm happy you found a buyer," and so on, I said, "Can we meet?" And I literally, it was a Sunday in Laurentians. I drove down from our place in Tremblant, and we had started a conversation. I said, "Listen, what's your plan?" And although there was a lot of happiness, everything I asked had a blank stare. They didn't know where they're moving. They didn't know what they're going to do with the money. They didn't know the plan. And I started digging. So I didn't push hard, but I said, would you mind if I got involved? And my dad was welcoming. He knew my skills and my interest in the topic and so on. I had not written a book by then, by the way. So, but he knew I had, some interests and abilities. My mom, which was a very proud woman, proud of what she gave us, was a little bit resistant, to be honest with you. And we had an open conversation and so on. And, to be very kind of jokingly at one point, I said, well, I'm really worried about my own plan. I don't know if I have to subsidize you guys. And so it we made it fun and so on. But that was the start of, yeah, I'm going to get involved. But I'm going to tell you, it took 6 months to put a financial plan in place. And you guys could put a financial plan overnight. The financial advisor had done, I could have done one too, but it was not about what we can do technically. It was about opening the conversation about their wishes and really pulling that out of them through time. So we went through a process, and I'm going to tell you, it took 6 months. To this day, I cherish those 6 months because I truly got to build a new kind of relationship. It required to build trust because it was a new kind of relationship with my parents, and there was some up and down, but we went one step at a time at the pace that was required to eventually build a plan that was theirs, not mine, not the one an advisor would have created. And at the same time, I gained so much knowledge and a great relationship that to this day is guiding me. My dad is still alive at 98. I manage most of his affairs now. But a lot of what I do on a monthly basis or daily basis, or when I'm confronted with decision, is based on the wisdom and knowledge I gained through those first 6 months and through the years after that.
It's amazing. You talk about trust. I think that for me, at least, the conversation, there's danger there in being perceived as being interested in the money or as being interested in the assets. I think for most children, at least, the prime
driver of the conversation is empathy. Like the prime driver of conversation is wanting to make sure that the couple of things that your parents are taken care of, that there's enough assets to your point, if there is longevity and if there is like health issues and so on and so forth. But third, and I think the most important, is that the wishes of the parents are actually upheld. Um, and so how do you manage that? How do you manage kind of like that fear that you're going to be perceived as being interested in the assets versus truly coming at it from a place of care?
This is not something you do in a rush.
Yeah.
You do it over time. And it's as everything in life. It's over time that your true intentions and values and beliefs and so on come out. So you don't always have the luxury of time, but that's why I say do it now and take your time as opposed to wait for a crisis. So that's one dimension. The other dimension is on the financial planning, and this is something, to be very candid, I haven't seen done very often. I recognize the financial plan, a good and complete financial plan, when you could summarize your net worth into three, I call them allotments. The allotment is what you need to live. Everyone worries about not having the money, but the first allotment will say, based on a properly put plan and all the mathematics and so on, you could live till this age on this amount of money, and you bucketize if you want in that allotment. The second allotment is what I call the rainy day protection. And the rainy day protection is to take care of those exceptional circumstances. Everyone worry about not having enough and what happens if I live too old or if I have extraneous healthcare and so on. And then third allotment was what I call legacy, is the money you will never need. And no one ever talks about, you will never need this. If you could summarize a plan in those categories, and then eventually you communicate with the greater family and the team or stakeholder, then it becomes clear. You do this over time. Okay. And I found it magical. And to be honest with you, I had, some discussion of, okay, do you want to get some inheritance or you want more protection or this? And my parents had a humble lifestyle, so there was not that much. So it was tight, but we managed to have those clear communication, and having a summary at that level really allowed that. But honestly, in the end, it was very clear to my parents. I was not there to minimize their day-to-day spending and their protection for inheritance. I was there to understand what were their choices. And it was not easy to get it out of them, to be honest with you, because most people don't think that proactively. But if you take it there, it's really magical.
We talked about your experience. You also see a lot of other people. It feels to me like it's a process. Like, I mean, we talk about a meeting, but fundamentally it's a process, because obviously like these are sensitive things. It's not a business meeting with an agenda, beginning, a middle, and an end. It's a conversation and it's a process. But how do you frame it in the sense of like, you talked about your experience, and I'm sure you talked to a lot of people and advise some people. When you make that phone call and you go, I think we need to talk. I mean, the next question is, what are we going to talk about? and so how do you prep? How do you prep? How do you frame? How do you do the work in advance so that that process or that meeting is as productive as possible? And that can be emotional or it can be kind of data driven. I hate to call it an agenda, but how do you frame it for people so that they come prepared for that conversation?
First of all, I don't think it's necessarily a phone call. It's the first thing I'm going to say. And, there's different method, depending, everyone has a different context, right?
If you're Gen Z, it's a message, or it's an Instagram, IM.
Yeah, an IM or whatever. I would share my kids in ongoing conversation, my interests in financial planning, and we had a pretty open conversation. And they knew I was working as I transitioned to retirement to plan for these things, so they knew of all of this. And at one point, I kind of said, "Okay, guys," casually, I said, "I'd like to start. I hear it's a good idea to have." Some ongoing conversation. I read this one book and I used this trigger, and eventually I said, what do you guys think about it? And eventually I opened up gradually and found the moment to say, okay, I'd like to have it now. So it didn't come as a surprise. It was not like out of the blue call, we're going to have a meeting. unfortunately, some people have to do that because there may be a crisis
Hmm.
situation and so on. And literally, I'm going to say, and you guys probably see this all the time. All of a sudden, someone had an accident, someone died way before they thought, and all this, and then everyone thinks they could get together and it's all going to happen. My recommendations, don't wait. Gradually plant the seeds, find the opportunistic moment to introduce it. It's not unlike any introduction of any new policy in a government or a policy in a corporation or a
Hmm.
new product you're introducing to the market. You have to set the stage, right?
You talk about an organizer. So, I mean, ClearEstate, we have a product for that. But if you're not a client of ClearEstate, what do people use? What's a good analog, I would say, organizer for estate matters? Because you talked about the fireproof box. I know my dad has a drawer somewhere in a metal file cabinet, and maybe the answer is whatever works for you. But what's a good organizer?
What you find out is most people don't have anything, is the reality. They either have a files cabinet, they go in the file cabinet as your dad or so on and so forth. And, you guys have probably seen there's a lot of, from a book to a tool on the net to document stuff and to a lot of, whether a Word document, Excel spreadsheet, or a bunch of folders and so on. So I'm going to consider myself a little bit of an extreme. Uh, there's a bunch of events that have triggered me to be compassionate, and my organizer is today 40 pages, and I revise it every year and test it to make sure. I said, I'm assuming the disaster is going to happen. We're both on a flight and so on, and someone's going to operate within 24 hours is in there. So that's a bit extreme. I've used some offline tools like Word and Excel and folders, but it's getting tedious, to be honest with you. And then some people get started. There are books out there that allow you to do this. There are tools out there, and like I say, but get started is my message, and eventually evolve. And eventually, if you realize the importance of having this up to date, accurate, and as complete as possible, eventually you're going to need a tool or some method to help you get organized.
So tell us a little bit about your journey. What led you to what you do today?
Probably the first trigger was my father-in-law. My father-in-law had a very successful career, retired relatively early. He loved to talk about financial planning and financial management. And when he retired, he actually spent a lot of time on estate planning. And he shared a fair amount with us, but not, in hindsight, not enough. He read a lot of books, put his own plan together. He never planned on losing his mind. And, as a dignity and respect of dignity, as he was losing his mind, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer. Um, he, in hindsight, he was starting to make changes. And there's one day he made a substantial transaction where he sold something substantial enough of 5 cents on the dollar. And that was the trigger for his daughters, my wife, to get involved and start looking back. And looking back, he had made changes to his financial plans. He had started using another advisor. He eventually had made another will, and it was all in the name of keeping control and simplifying things because everything had put together, now he can grasp it anymore. So he was taking changes. And we were able to recover a lot of that. Just we won't go through the whole story, but that was the first trigger. And it said, and through this is how do I get organized and plan for the unplanned? And my inspiration was, what if I start losing my own mind, my own abilities? And today I'm easily can admit that I'm not as sharp as I was 10 years ago, and my kids are very sharp. So why wouldn't I get them involved, or why wouldn't I get a professional organization involved to shadow me and work with me?
So if I'm a professional and I'm listening to you and I read your book, what's the first thing I can change in my practice that makes it I'll have immediate impact on the families that I'm advising?
My my saying, and I've said it many times, is said, you will differentiate yourself if you broaden the scope of conversation, because guess what? That's what your client want. When is it you get a call from your client? Well, usually it's a period of life transition and so on. I said, be proactive, be prepared for that, first of all, you'll differentiate yourself and so on. So to me, it's to broaden that conversation and engage in proactive communication beyond just what may be the immediate scope of this. And I've seen a lot of practices and you guys have done this. I mean, I've seen how you expanded your practice where you bring the right experts so that you could bring consolidation of all the aspects. Early on, I had a person quite well positioned in the financial industry read my book and said, "There's nothing new in there." It says, and then he says, "I went and Googled it and said no one brought it all together." So there's expertise in finance, there's expertise in legal, there's expertise in organization, you know, healthcare planning, and so on and so forth. But no one brings the framework so that you have a consolidated approach to move it. And you may not know that, David, but I reached out to early on to ClearEstate because I was very happy to see where you guys were doing because we're not only trying to bring the whole picture, but you were trying to facilitate certain aspects that are tedious, and so on. So, it's a long answer here, but I think it's that's what it takes.
Sara, anything to add here? I know Sara is our resident guru. She's
Met Sara a few times. She is a guru.
She's a guru. She's seen crazy stories. And any questions?
Yep, seen too many crazy stories, but Marc, super interesting conversation. Now you mentioned talking about transitions, and I know that that's part of your mantra, but when you touched on transitions, it seemed like you're more almost referring to potentially sort of voluntary transitions, which is, I think, unlike the way people normally think about planning for, power of attorneys and healthcare needs and things like that. Do you see that as something that people desire more now, is kind of phasing themselves out of the work, that the administrative burden of their lives, more so than thinking about, some catastrophe happening, in your experience?
I tell people I'm probably the 0.001% of the population that would even consider activation and let alone transition and proactively. So no, absolutely. I mean, so I think there's a lot of work. So the quick answer is no. That is not natural. It wasn't, it isn't today, and it's going to take a long-term time. Now, part of it is we need to start, explaining what transition could be. An early transition is awareness of where information is, and eventually is knowledge of the information. I'm going to tell you a little bit where I'm at. I've had a financial plan that's pretty thorough and detailed. I've shared it openly in the family meeting, including my daughter-in-law. I'm very inclusive in my own family meeting. So they have a clear visibility of my three allotments and so on. But deep down inside, I wanted my delegates that are, I've delegated my power of attorney for property and finance to start getting deeper into the knowledge, and because I put some great stuff. And honestly, there was an event recently that triggered that. And yeah, one of my sons says, yeah, I'd like to know more. I'm happy to take on the role now. I understand more, but I need to get more. So I said, okay, you're going to reserve half a day. He says, yes, I will do that. This is my less busy time of the year. But again, we're talking about transition. I'm not having to manage my affairs. I'm just gradually, going from knowledge to deeper knowledge to eventually maybe you want to pick up one of these things or not. And in the case of my parents, after the first pass, they asked me, I left my dad to manage the day-to-day cash flow, and he was not interested in managing, the small amount of investment in the rainy day bucket. So we need to have the lightweight definition of transition, because no, I'm way too young for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like people are still wanting to maintain control, but the conversations are more open with that next generation, which is a good thing.
I think for a lot of people, it's control, but I also think for some people, it's dignity of independence. Ask someone, when is it time to let go to your driver's license? And it's probably the toughest action someone would do, because it's almost a statement of you have lost your independence.
from my cold dead hands.
So, there's a whole lot of subconscious. Yeah, yeah, and the other thing I've heard, uh, a lot of people is I don't want to jinx it. A lot of people won't. Well, you guys probably see this. I'm not gonna do a power of attorney or a will, and so I'm gonna jinx it. Or I'm not gonna do an advanced care plan. I'm gonna jinx it. I've heard that so often.
Super interesting. Couple of thoughts here. Now, you talked about the plan B, and there's no really a plan B. It's more about managing kind of like the situation of the family and managing around it. Thinking about that meeting, I mean, you've seen a lot of cases, you talk to a lot of people. What works? Like, is it like we order pizza, we walk around and like we talk about it? Like, is it like so? I just want to get very tactical and concrete here. Like what's the setting? What's the playbook? Like, how do you set it up?
I'm going to share what I've done, okay? Because, that's my playbook. And over the years, I've decided we need to turn these meetings into, oh no, it's not the death talk again, to it's got to be fun and proactive. And I started using facilitation techniques that I've, learned in my corporate. So 2 years ago, we actually used post-it stickers and we had an exercise.
Flip charts and post-its and stickers
Absolutely,
and oh
absolutely.
yeah, awesome.
So we did that last year. So last year was year four. So year four, my objective was, okay, we talked about this, but I want to get your hands dirty. I want, if something happened, and I want you to get and find out what's in there, not just, okay, yeah, there's an organizer in this. So we actually had a scenario. It was a pretty bleak scenario. And I say, okay, this is what's happened. Mom and dad had an accident. Mom's in the hospital. They're asking for a decision to do a transfusion and an operation. This dad's dead, and uh, they're asking what to do with the body. And by the way, it's the end of the month, and you have to pay the mortgage on the rental property and collect the mortgage. So what do you do? So, and I preamble.
I really like that
Okay,
idea.
so
Like
it was a pretty.
throwing scenarios at the family.
So it was
That's a
a pretty bleak.
curveball.
So up front, it was a pretty bleak scenario. But I'm going to tell you what happened. I did have them run down to the safe where some of the stuff may be. I had the documents there. I said, okay, it was really interesting and pleasing in the end because they all started looking at themselves, staring at each other, and one of the persons stood up. Well, didn't he have a healthcare director? So they started working as a team. And really, I didn't push it. I didn't ask them to give me the answers. I wanted to see that dynamic evolve and say, yes, there is the decision for house would be in here, and the account would be documented in here. And by the way, we're activated the bank, so we could go and do this, and we could find the password there. So that is kind of so. I don't. Every year I've worked the agenda, but we're trying to find a facilitation technique that is going to make it fun. So we're turning something that was negative into turning something fun. And by the way, my fifth meeting is tomorrow, and I'm in the process of planning for tomorrow, and I do have
So
another exercise.
what's the scenario tomorrow? I want to know.
But
What's
tomorrow's not a
the
scenario. There's a few updates on a few things. Tomorrow I'm digging. I've been very tuned into two topics. One is the one of plan giving. Unless you had means to give in charity all your
Mhm.
life, planned giving is not necessarily a natural thing. So that's one aspect that's got my curiosity. But the other aspect is if you're on a self-managed pension, uh, the reality is that if you die early, there will be more assets than you ever planned in inheritance. So I've evolved with the concept of a staggered will. So what's your wishes? We all start with my wish is I'll leave this if it's, there'll be so much left when I'm 95 and this much. But when you start thinking is there'll be that much more if I die in the next 5 years or tomorrow. So I'm going to open that conversation. So I've been wanting to open the conversation, but see what would they do if they had all this, or what if we decide to give more planned giving? So I'm exploring that, and I'm exploring it through, and I haven't put it in place yet, but about 2 years ago, I was exposed to a writing exercise and how to get people, they're going to write for a few minutes, and based on a trigger topic around these topics, and then it's going to open the conversation. So that's kind of what we're going to do tomorrow night.
Well, that's a fun Tuesday night. Marc, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Lots of good insights, lots of things to think about, and we'll have you again to let us know how that meeting went, how that fifth meeting went.
I would welcome the opportunity, and really thank you for having me, and thank you for what you're doing.
Thanks again to Marc Seguin. You can find his work at advocacyandaging.com. So we wanted as many different expert perspectives as we could on this issue. All families are different. People have different perspectives on this. There's family dynamics, but also there's personal things. There's a spirituality to it. It's a complex issue, and by bringing in Kim Nelson and Mike Love from our team here at ClearEstate, and we call it our Estate Pros panel. We wanted to get a bit more of a technical conversation from people that are having these conversations regularly, these family meetings, and get more tips and tricks, but also more examples of either successful or unsuccessful estate planning processes, and more particularly on the family meeting side. We're joined now by two resident ClearEstate experts on estate planning, Kim and Mike. Welcome, guys.
Hi.
Hi, thank you.
So we wanted to chat a little bit today about the family meeting and estate planning and the conversation that needs to happen between somebody that's thinking about their estate plan, thinking about their legacy, thinking about next steps, and their family members. We know that very often there's a trigger. Something happens that kind of triggers both the thinking around estate planning, but also that conversation. In your experience, Kim, what's a typical trigger, and what should I be looking for example, when thinking about this in terms of what are the events or the things that happen in a person's life that may trigger the necessity for that kind of conversation?
I think generally the triggers are a life event, birth in the family, a death, a change in relationship, divorce, marriage, and a health scare is often a big one as well, where you're all of a sudden faced with your mortality and realize that you're not set up for success in terms of what's going to happen in terms of your estate, but also that maybe you haven't had the meaningful conversations that you needed to have with your family to make sure that it doesn't cause a problem when you're gone. So I would say, yeah, major life events and including health scare are the big ones.
In that conversation, two parties can initiate the meeting or the dialogue. I can have a health scare and trigger it with my family, or I can have a health scare and then my child can come to me and go, "Hey, have you thought about it?" What's typical there? I mean, I guess that nothing's typical, but in your experience, and I'm always a bit mindful of, as a child, not to appear selfish or self-interested in triggering that conversation. Is there a right way to do that?
I mean, like you said, there are multiple ways, and I think that you're right on when you say that as a child, it's maybe a bit more complicated. Parents think they're in control for most of our lifetimes, and in a lot of families, parents still. Parents always view their children as children, I think, for the most part, right? And so having that conversation initiated by a child may be difficult. It may be scary as well for the parent if they're not prepared to have the conversation themselves already. So ideally, it's initiated by the parent or by, the person who needs to put their estate plan in place. Ideally, they give themselves a second to think about it and to really kind of map out what they want. And then they initiate the conversation with their child or with not everyone has children, or with, their siblings or with whoever they want to leave their estate to. Ideally, that's the situation.
Mike, I know you've helped in the past some families
have that meeting or have that conversation, what's the happy path? What's the ideal? How does it happen when it's great? And then we'll go to how does it happen when it's not so great? But let's start with the happy path.
Yeah, the happy path is definitely the ideal. And it's not necessarily for every family, but I think if you have, a parent or parents that have, had a life event, or, they've maybe been an executor or seen someone do it and realized that, I don't want to put that on my children in quite the same way that I saw it happen, with someone else. They'll do their estate planning, and then it's a very healthy instinct to want to tell your family what you've done to make their lives easier. In the absence of maybe family conflict, it can be that happy path where the testators, the parents, would sit down with the family and discuss, this is what we're doing. And from their perspective, it gives them a lot of confidence that everyone knows what's going to happen, and setting those expectations and just being kind of clear and open with everyone. And from the family's perspective, kids and other people that are part of the family, it also kind of gives them some emotional preparedness for what's going to happen, and a sense of relief that things are sorted and it's not going to fall to them. People know what is expected of them and what is not, which provides a lot of relief for them as well. And if they are involved as an executor or under a power of attorney or alongside a professional, that also becomes very important to understand, okay, I'm not going to do this alone, or I'll just be there to kind of support my family emotionally, not have to do all the work.
And what's the not so happy path?
So I've been doing this a long time, and there are reasons that people involve professionals or do their estate planning because they're trying to maintain family harmony or prevent any existing conflict from becoming worse. In that case, it needs to be dealt with very delicately. Some families decide to forego the family meeting intentionally, and in some ways that is the right decision. But depending on what's happening and what the intention is, there are ways to scale it back a little bit. So maybe you're not letting everybody know the same information. Sometimes you would have multiple meetings with different people, or just intentionally, be like, we've hired professionals. You don't need to worry about it, and that's it. In other cases, you can explain, maybe I'm setting up a trust for all of you or for one of you. That can be risky if there is potential for conflict, and you just need to sort of assess how much information is the right amount of information for that meeting.
Is there a typical agenda for that meeting? I mean, and by agenda, I mean, this is not a business meeting, but is there key topics that should be covered in the happy path?
In the happy path, providing a summary of what happens with different components of the estate plan. So, what happens when power of attorney gets triggered? What happens on the first death of mom and the second death of dad? And just how the process works generally. That's pretty harmless most of the time. And then revealing like the details of the plan that they've actually created. So who's playing what roles, who's getting what in terms of inheritance, and when and how. Those would typically be covered as well, but some of them you might hold them back depending on the situation.
Kim, I mean, there's information that needs to be gathered in order to have a productive conversation. Apart from the will, is there like a set of basic things that are required that facilitate and or relieve pressure on the family in general, whether there's kids or not?
I actually wanted to jump on one thing that you said when you said it's not a business meeting. In litigious families, it kind of is a business meeting, because you have to be able to take the emotion out of the situation and just focus on what are the high-level things that everybody needs to understand and be, I mean, not in agreement upon, but everyone needs to understand to reduce conflict later on. So whether it's, an unequal distribution, why was it done? You don't have to explain specifically how much it is, but just on a conceptual basis, why were certain decisions made? Whether it's for tax reasons, whether it's for other reasons, how the reasoning came about, and just explain context maybe over detail. And in that case, it does become a business meeting. In terms
Interesting.
Yeah, it's just that's how you focus on a common goal and have clear steps. And in terms of documentation, other than if there were previous wills or powers of attorney, letters of direction, in terms of being able to actually leave letters to specific individuals, uh, outlining their responsibilities or outlining things that you would just simply like them to know. Exclusions sometimes of a beneficiary. Sometimes there are really specific reasons for that. So letters of that sort. Um, Personal effects memorandums. Like I have clients often when they have a lot of personal effects, whether it's artwork or whatever, I tell them, take a picture of them or make a catalog of them. And next time you have everyone over, have everyone choose what they want. It's a very transparent, democratic process. And, there's no surprise at the end of when it comes time to settle the estate, everybody kind of knows what's up. So any kind of documentation, I would say, that can provide clarity, again, without necessarily going into an enormous amount of detail, is helpful.
It's interesting. I'm hearing to both of you talk. Have you seen a meeting end up changing the plan in the sense of like, have you seen the family's reaction to decisions that were made in the end? I wouldn't say backfire, but kind of come back and go, well, somebody goes, okay, actually, I talked about it with everybody, and I'm actually going to change the plan, Mike.
Definitely. And that is a risk. Sometimes people in the family take it as an opportunity to lobby for changes and to dispute the plan that is put in place. Um, I was just reminded, wills from a long time ago used to be quite different. I remember at one point I was investigating the Rhodes Scholarship and how that came about. And that was actually embedded in the will of Cecil Rhodes, who founded De Beers. Um, and, he had family all over the world. So he actually wasn't able to, I guess, conduct a family meeting. So what he did was he actually put a lot of emotional content in his will, which is something you don't really see very often anymore because we can have family meetings, so we can set the expectations in real life prior to death. But his will, for example, like explained why he did things and how people were important to him and why this and why that. And anyway, it's very interesting, but it definitely is another way to go about doing it. If you do want to, like Kim mentioned, like a letter of wishes doesn't really belong in the will, in my opinion, these days. But you can leave kind of side notes to people so that even if you don't want to reveal surprises to people during your lives, you can kind of leave those that commentary to people so that they have it when you're gone, and hopefully so that they get why you did what you did.
Is there things in the family meeting, or I mean, it might not just be one meeting, but an overall conversation? Are there signals that may point somebody that's planning, that may point them towards professional executorship? Families don't tear each other apart in the moment. It takes a bit of time. Are there things that may signal, hey, like in this particular case, maybe we should turn to professionals?
Families do tear each other apart in family meetings too.
I'm trying to describe the happy path here.
I have seen families argue hard at meetings. I would say a few flags to me that things are going to go awry are, the discussion starts and then questions start to come up about, why a certain person is doing what they're doing, why a certain person has been given a certain role, and then going silent, like people who mine for information, but then stop participating in the conversation, stop engaging. There's often something that's being unsaid and that's going to manifest at some other point. Where there have been difficult family dynamics as well, just in terms of, either relationship with a parent, relationships between siblings, relationships, whatever. Um, the emotional tension tends to only get worse when you put grief on top of it, or when you put, grief manifests in really strange ways when you're talking about death. It comes out as resentment sometimes or anger. So when you've already got, complicated family dynamics in place, you're probably going to end up at some point by needing a professional executor. When you've got sometimes several of the people that are involved in the estate who are very knowledgeable and who might have very strong opinions, that can also end up by causing conflict at some point down the road. I know of a family that one of the sons is a lawyer and the other son just loves numbers. He's not even an accountant. He loves numbers and he loves spreadsheets. The son that's a lawyer got appointed to be the executor. The son that loves the spreadsheets is livid that he wasn't the one that's appointed because he loves organizing these things and he feels like his father should have entrusted him with this because he also has more time. So sometimes even a wealth of knowledge can be problematic. Sometimes people who are appointed who it's not clear why they were appointed because they don't necessarily have the specific knowledge. Um, like maybe because the parent or the loved one thinks that they're better at managing people, but they don't necessarily have the knowledge to deal with the estate, for example, the accounting or ability to interact. There are a lot of when you start seeing that there are discrepancies between roles and between capability, or when there are odd dynamics or lack of engagement, those will generally point to issues happening down the road.
Both of you, you've seen family meetings and you've participated in those meetings. Is there a benefit in having a third party facilitator or somebody that's kind of like supporting the family in not only the meeting but the whole estate planning process, but I mean in that particular meeting, is a stranger a plus or is a stranger a minus to the dynamics of the family?
What I think happens a lot, and we don't always know or see that it has happened, is that there's been a family meeting before they plan their estate. And that has actually triggered them to start doing the planning and often involve a professional to do the planning, or also a professional to be executor, for example, because they've identified that there is potential for cracks in family harmony, or there's already very clear conflict in the family, and they've decided that it is a very worthwhile investment to set things up to hopefully repair the situation, or avoid um, you know future conflict. And a lot of the times it becomes a really basic ROI calculation, right? I mean, you can name the kids as executors and they'll tear each other apart. They'll spend all the estate money on litigation. Grandchildren that are cousins with each other won't have relationships anymore. Christmas gatherings won't be what they once were. And they realize that, you can actually pay less to a professional who will be the one that will be disliked and get paid to do it.
Professionally disliked.
Exactly. And I'm not kidding. Like, that is, people do pay professionals to be the bad guy. Um, and it doesn't always work, but a lot of the time it does. And to take the heat off of the family going at each other is a very, very small price to pay to leave a positive legacy rather than a negative legacy. Because if you get it wrong, you put the wrong people in certain roles, and you set up what's happening in the wrong way, it can reverberate through multiple generations and fracture families. So yeah, when they do, we've been talking a lot about the family meeting being like after they've done their wills, but there most definitely are these other ones that do happen beforehand, and that is where they find out, okay, I need to do something here.
I think there's also the matter of the professional executor has, no skin in the game, as we say. So there is also the fact that whereas when you're discussing between family members, there are dynamics that are involved in all of those relationships, and there is ideas of who the other person is and what their potential agenda is, or whatever, or how they feel about each other that will always come and influence that. So now you've got this third party who you can't accuse of having any preconceived notions or having any, taking sides, because they're here objectively to settle the estate. Like I recently saw a family where there were three siblings, and two were never involved in the parent's life. The one that was involved was named as executor. The parent died, and the two siblings all of a sudden showed up, the other ones, because they thought that they were going to inherit. And they have made the person who was involved's life horrendous. And they based all of their they had a lot of recriminations based on just relationships between the sibling and the other sibling who had been involved in the parent's life and the parent. So you've actually got a third party who really has no involvement and who is strictly here, yes, to play the bad guy, but also who you can't accuse of having any, preference or really leaning one way or another. It's like a mediator, right? Or an arbitrator. It's an impartial third party.
I'd like to end this on a positive note. Have you seen families come closer together? Can this be positive in terms of family harmony and happiness?
Most definitely. It can be a huge relief to people, like the parents and the children and the rest of the family, to know that there's going to be a referee in the ring, and no one's getting chosen over somebody else. It's just going to be dealt with externally. It can bring down the temperature of existing conflicts. It can result in like family healing of issues that have been long unresolved. Not always. It's not the perfect solution to everything, but it definitely can create a tremendous amount of relief and set the stage for like a better future and better family relationships. And when that happens, it feels great, obviously.
Kim?
I was going to say a lot of sensitive things can actually be covered more easily with having a third party that is not, again, that has no skin in the game. So I think that does allow sometimes for a more open and a more transparent conversation. I also think, and I think this is really underestimated, that you also just have the time to grieve or to deal with whatever personal, things that you have to deal with without adding on top of that litigious family situation, a potential litigation, even if, things are really going askew. Just the freedom to deal with whatever is happening and not to have to throw on paperwork and communications and litigation and arguments, like I said, and just the menial work, like the grunt work of settling an estate. That's a non-negligible relief.
Kim, Mike, thank you so much for being on the podcast, and we'll definitely have you over some more to talk about fun stuff like estate planning and administration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So thanks again to Kim and Mike for sharing their thoughts. That was super, super, super interesting. So Sara, what do you make? What do you make of all of this? Like, I think Marc is. I mean, like I think he was like his fifth. It was the day before was his fifth family meeting. So obviously he cares a lot about it. But what's your key highlight?
Yeah, I think something that stood out in particular for me that was a bit of a reoccurring theme is that, like, even where it's a sort of happy situation, like these are ideal times to make these plans and have these conversations, right? Don't wait for, some sort of crisis situation to start having these conversations, right? Because that makes the conversations harder and more heavy than they already are, right? And even where, there's no real known conflicts in a family, these types of, transparent, all hands on deck meetings are super important and valuable. But where there is potential conflict and, maybe some issues, it's even more valuable. So I think, the key here is there's probably no situation that doesn't warrant, a family meeting as part of your estate planning and your kind of ongoing, financial and estate health checks, right? But a lot of really good nuggets in there on, the practical side of things and how detailed you can go and how to approach the conversation sensitively and thoughtfully.
Yeah, so I have to say,
of all the conversations we've had up until now, all the topics on the podcast, this one is the one that I've used the most in my daily life, and so I've started the process with my mother, and kind of like just more openly having the conversation. I think it was a relief for her. Like, I think it was, hey, like, can we have this conversation? And also kind of the expression from me that what was important for me was her well-being.
Yes, of
not
course.
how much money
Of
I got
course.
at the end.
Yes.
I think it was, I mean, that kind of like opened up a more fruitful conversation. And, I think at some point we talked about, and I think it was with Matt, the multiple moves, like this idea of when you have kind of like that end of life planning and you start thinking, okay, how many moves am I going to make in the next 10, 15 years? That was also very, like, it kind of informed
of course.
the kind of planning. So anyway, very useful
absolutely.
for me.
I think also Marc's framing around separating, separating things into buckets and separating what you think you're going to potentially need and use during your lifetime versus what is ultimately going to be your estate and your, financial legacy in the end. And a lot of folks don't look at it that way. They kind of count all of it as both, right? Which it's never going to be all of it as both. Like that's not the reality. So reframing it in that way, I think, is helpful for everybody involved, including like that perception of, is this, what is this really about? If when you're asking me, about the plans for my estate, to approach it from, in a healthy, helpful way.
And one final question for you, Sara. Like, how beneficial is it to have a TEP with you, or kind of like, or at least guiding you through this process? I mean, I guess the ultimate thing is to have the TP in the room during the family meeting, kind of mediating or taking notes. But how helpful is it?
It's a great question, and I mean, let's. I'm biased, I guess, because I'm a TEP, but I would say immensely valuable because normally when you're talking about these topics, you're going to be covering things that are obvious and things that people understand, at least, on the surface. But most of the time, you're also going to be covering things that people don't necessarily understand, or different people have different understandings and maybe even misconceptions about what things actually mean, and even like the roles that are going to be involved, the responsibilities, timelines, all of those things. So having someone with experience in, having these discussions with families, but also being able to answer practical and logistical questions as you go through the explanations is, I would say, super helpful, right? So they can act as somebody to guide the agenda and also help to sort of prevent anything becoming too maybe adversarial, because sometimes, that does happen. So stick to kind of the facts at hand in the process and the decisions and things like that, and not and control, any tangents a little bit, but also to then be able to actually practically answer questions that, family members may have. And oftentimes families will have really excellent questions. And you don't know what those are until you start having these conversations, right? So I would say, yeah, definitely, highly valuable.
Somebody told me that one of our plans at ClearEstate includes a family meeting guidance.
That
correct?
is true. That is true.
Yes.
We do.
Did I scoop anything
here? We do now have a plan that does include us facilitating the family meeting at the end of your estate planning, sort of once it's finalized, which I think is, it has an immense value for families, like I explained.
Yeah, and a little bird told me that you played a large role in framing that. Don't forget to share and subscribe to The Endgame by ClearEstate on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for joining us. Take care.
ThinkBait. TNKR Media. Good talk.